Is the Fox Roundtable discussing Trump's so-called outreach to the black community when he appeared at the Great Faith Ministries Church in Detroit, Michigan.
Rights agenda for our time, one that ensures the rights to a great education, so important, and the right to live in safety and in peace, and to have a really, really great job.
Donald Trump reaching out to black voters at an African-American church in inner-city Detroit yesterday. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Fox News senior political analyst Brit Hume, Neera Tanden, president of the liberal think tank, the Center for American Progress, Ann Giron of the Washington Post, and syndicated columnist George Will. Brit, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you.
What do you think of Trump's visit to Detroit and that black church yesterday? And what do you think of his outline in very broad strokes of an agenda for civil rights?
Well, I think it was probably worth a try. But I sense that he will probably get more credit with white voters for making the effort than he will from voters in the inner city whose resistance to appeals from Republicans going back decades has been remarkably strong.
What resistance? The GOP hasn't outreached to African Americans for decades. So that statement is bullshit.
I doubt he'll make any inroads of any consequence in that particular segment of the electorate. But nonetheless, you had people looking to find a way that they could possibly support him. We'll see this soft-spoken version of Donald Trump making what I think are some detailed and serious-sounding, at least, proposals, and that might do him some good, but probably not within that community.
Neera, if Trump weren't talking about these issues, you'd criticize him. Are you going to criticize him for talking about these issues?
I think the fact that he's at 0% of support in some swing states of African Americans is heretofore well-deserved of his policies. I actually think the fact that you pointed out that these policies he stated yesterday are not on his website and his history. I mean, I think the reality here is that most African Americans have come to know him from his attacks on the first African American president, his birtherism, but also his history. The New York Times has a long, detailed story last week about Trump Industries and a history of housing discrimination that goes back 30 years. So I think there's a long record here, and 2 months before the election, having never gone to a black church or even engaged in discussions with black audiences, I think people see this as a transparent attempt and make up something where he's far behind. He's far behind McCain's numbers, Romney's numbers with African American voters, which weren't strong, but he's still far behind them.
George?
You said 2 months before the election. We're 19 days before the voting starts in some states, and Mr. Trump is saying essentially, never mind what I've said so far, I'm going to change. He campaigned for 400 days after announcing his candidacy and then said, I've got some regrets. He didn't say what they were, but he said, I've got some regrets. He goes to the black church, reiterates standard Republican views, school choice and all the rest. But people are supposed to forget he's a birther. At least he was. He's the one who said he'd sent, 5 years ago, I've sent investigators to Hawaii to investigate the president's birth, and people are going to be amazed by what they found. He hasn't told us, but again, they're supposed to forget that. He goes to Mexico and says, the people I've described as rapists are actually now exemplary Americans. Then he goes to Phoenix, and he chooses to be introduced by Joe Arpaio, the sheriff of Maricopa County, who's the very face of hostility to immigrants. I don't think it'll work. Obviously, the Hispanic vote, like all American votes, isn't quite monolithic. But still, what should worry Republicans most of all is in 2012, Mitt Romney did even worse among Asian Americans than he did among Hispanics, which indicates that minorities generally do not feel welcome in the Republican Party.
Brit, are you as resistant to his outreach to minority voters as Brother Will here?
Well, there is a contrast, obviously, between this soft-spoken man speaking in that church yesterday and the bombastic Trump of days before we heard so much of, which suggests to me that the impression that African-American voters and other minority voters as well may have of him, it may be sitting in cement which is why all the things George cites, I think, are part of the reason why I think he'll have trouble rallying much support, if any, in the community, whereas Nair pointed out he stands in some states at 0.
Yeah, that's bad. All right, let's turn to the issue of Hispanics, because Trump also tried to make an outreach this week to the Hispanic community. A couple of weeks of talking about softening his position on mass deportations. Then, as we see in the middle of the week, he went on Wednesday to Mexico City, met, had a very respectful press conference afterwards with Mexican President Peña Nieto, sounding a diplomatic note. But later that same day in Phoenix, he said this.
Day one, my first hour in office, those people are gone. You can call it deported if you want. The press doesn't like that term. You can call it whatever the hell you want. They're gone.
And Trump was talking there specifically about illegal immigrants who commit further crimes, not just coming across the border illegally, but further crimes once they get in. But despite that specific point, for all of this back and forth over the last 2 weeks, was he going to soften? Was he going to harden? Did it do him any good with Hispanic voters?
Well, probably not a great deal. I mean, you see the dueling efforts here of Kellyanne Conway and a group of other Trump advisors who are pulling him in opposite directions on what he should be doing to at least give a credible sense of outreach and openness to.
All right. Why didn't you just mention their names, Steve Bannon and Roger Ailes? You mentioned Kellyanne Conway. Why not mention them? Because they are personas non gratas. And you're trying to keep as low a profile on those two guys as possible. Because any mention of their names automatically raises the haunches of people.
Hispanic voters. She's a pollster, she's a demographer. She sees the ultimate imperative of his having to have an outreach to Hispanic voters, and for Republicans to have an outreach to Hispanic voters past this election, whatever happens to it. She's doing making some effort to have him make that outreach. I think what you're left with here is you can pick which Trump you like from 5 hours apart, right? They were different people saying different things, and Hispanic voters are going to look at both of those images and certainly more likely see that what he said in Phoenix as the real Donald Trump.
But I'm going to pick up on this with you, George, and let me begin first of all with this question, because we asked you for questions for the panel, and we got this on Twitter from Ron, who tweets, "Voters have their minds made up, especially the African-American voters." So, George, let me ask you, first of all, how do you answer Ron? But also, what about this point that you heard from Ben Carson, that you hear from Donald Trump? Look, you've had decades of Democratic government in America's inner cities. They control, they're the bosses in most of the elected officials in most American inner cities, and things have not gotten better in a lot of places. And as we pointed out in some statistics, they've actually gotten worse.
It's indisputably true what Ben Carson says. The blue model of government, so-called, the alliance of the Democratic Party and the public employees unions, particularly the teachers unions standing athwart school choice, has not served the African community well, African American community that's in the cities. That said, there's no reason to believe that the standard Republican appeal, school choice, welfare reform, all the rest, that Jack Kemp brought to American politics, he ran as the running mate of Bob Dole, had no effect so far as I can tell. And I don't see it having any effect this time around.
All right, we have to take a break here, but we'll see you panel a little later. Up next,
All right, so that's pretty much the round table. I'll scan through to see if they pick this thing back up. Okay, they did pick it back up in discussing Clinton and her lack of memory. Here we go.
Not to send classified information. As I said, that's the definition of negligent. I think she was extremely careless. I think she was negligent.
FBI Director James Comey telling Congress while he didn't see grounds for prosecution, Hillary Clinton mishandled classified material on her private server while she was Secretary of State. And we're back now with the panel. So Britt, in her FBI interview, by one count, Clinton said 27 times that she did not recall or could not remember key events and details. As for the emails about drone attacks and CIA assets, she said that she relied on her staff, and if they sent her something, she assumed it was not classified. Do you find those explanations or failure to recall persuasive?
Of course not. And I don't think many normal people would. And it simply furthers this impression people have that this is an extraordinarily, exceptionally secretive and even indeed dishonest person now running for the highest office in the land. Under normal circumstances, such things as the mishandling of classified information, negligence in the handling of classified information would be utterly disqualifying. In this particular year, under the circumstances, given the nature of the opposing candidate, she's ahead. Whether over time this stuff, and there's likely to be more of it, will weigh her down to the point where people just might find it in their hearts to vote for the alternative is the question. Based on the polling we've seen so far, it doesn't look like it will be enough, but it's something to watch out for.
Neera, we should point out you are close to the Clinton campaign. You've been an advisor to her over the years. We all know Hillary Clinton is whip smart. So how do you explain her vagueness on all these events and even saying she didn't really understand how the classification system worked?
No, she didn't say she didn't understand how the classification system worked. I mean, I think what's good about this is that everyone can read these documents. I've read them.
She said she didn't really understand the difference between various levels of classification.
No,
and in the C marking, she said she didn't understand that at all.
She said that she took all the classifications very seriously. So she didn't differentiate in the way she handled because all of them were seriously. That's what she said in the testimony.
Which is why she did it on that private email.
And I think this issue, I think the issue of the emails is she has, I recommend people read this. There's 27 or so emails that she's asked to remember out of 60,000. She couldn't recall each one of those emails, but you see in the process that
wait. That's not quite true. She says it various ways. It isn't just emails. She's asked, do you remember when you were told how the classification system worked? And she said she didn't remember that specific briefing.
Right. That's
not an email. That's a briefing.
Let's just be clear. I want to be crystal clear about this. Out of the 27 times Britt mentioned, many of them are emails. So that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. We want to be crystal clear about that. So I think the important thing here is just to step back, that we have had this massive investigation into this effort. There, you see from this why the FBI did not move forward with any other action on this. And I think she's recognized that this was a mistake to set up the server.
Okay.
And she said that
I want to pick up on one other.
Whereas I
want to pick up on one other aspect of this.
I'm sure, but I just need to say that we have not had we've had a full discussion of this, but we just learned this week that Donald Trump was engaged in a pay-to-play with the Attorney General.
Can we stick to this
I'm happy to, but I would love. There's not a lot of coverage in Fox. I would love to get some coverage for that as well.
Okay. Well, it has gotten covered. But in addition, in March of 2015, in her news conference at the United Nations, here's how Clinton explained using a private email system.
I opted for convenience to use my personal email account, which was allowed by the State Department, because I thought it would be easier to carry just one device for my work and for my personal emails instead of two.
But Neera, the FBI says she didn't use one email device. She didn't use two email devices. She used 15 BlackBerries. Okay. And if I may just finish the question, and the FBI was unable to recover 13 of those 50.
This is a great point. There were always one BlackBerry at a time. She didn't use 15 at a time. I've gone through, I know it's ridiculous. I've gone through my fair number of BlackBerries, but it's not that she had 15 BlackBerries at a time. I think this is an important part of reading through this investigation. You'll see that that's the reality.
All right. George, what do you make of the FBI interview, and what effect do you think it'll have on the campaign?
Well, there are two kinds of scandals that are ruinous for a candidate. One is one that reinforces a negative narrative about the candidate, and the other is that subverts a positive narrative. This amazing email scandal does both. That is, it reinforces the idea that the Clintons are entitled and shady and indifferent to the distinction between law and not law. And it subverts the idea that she's a seasoned, experienced government official who looked at the C marking and said, gee, what could that mean? Could it mean classified? She had no idea, evidently. clearly she or people acting on her behalf destroyed materials that were under subpoena from a congressional committee, just as the IRS did with Lois Lerner. So this is a very familiar matter. Now, does this matter? How many people are at this point undecided? I maintain still the belief that most Americans give more due diligence to the selection of a car than a presidential candidate, and I'm not sure that details of this granularity matter.
All right. We're almost out of time, and I want to bring Ann in because on this question of whether or not it matters, the race is clearly tightening. I'm going to put up some numbers. On August 9th, in the Real Clear Politics average of polls, Clinton was leading Trump by more than 7 points. Now that lead is down to 3. As somebody covering the Clinton campaign, do they think that the revelations, the continued series of revelations about the emails and the relationship with the Clinton Foundation, that it's hurting her?
Clearly it is hurting her. I mean, the Clinton campaign would like to finally put the entire email episode in the past and move on from it, and every couple of weeks or so something happens that doesn't allow them to do so. I will say, however, they've always factored in that the race would probably be within 5 points at the end. So if we're at a more or less, if we're at stasis now, they'll take it.
All right. And I will, on your behalf, Nira, say that you file a strong dissent on all of this. Thank you, Pat. I'll see you next Sunday. Up next,
that was pretty good. I always enjoy Chris Wallace's roundtables. They're lively. You can always depend on certain people to have certain attitudes. But Chris is pretty much even keeled. He pretty much holds everybody's feet to the fire.